We're going to turn things over to Annette, Anina and Mike. Anina is the engineer for the district leading our investigation and recommendations into our rubberized floors in our gymnasiums. Mike is the CIH and the industrial hygienist who is also involved in this process. And they're here to do a full report tonight on their findings and recommendations. So I'll turn things over to you, Anina, at this time.
Thank you, Joe. Can everyone hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Excellent. You can never quite tell when you're the one doing the speaking. So first of all, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak tonight. For those of you who were not here a month ago, I'm going to go back in time a little bit just so that if you're hearing any of this information for the first time, we'll get you caught up. So what has happened to date is we have basically completed occupied air sampling in all the gyms where there's rubberized floors within the district. So tonight is kind of a summary presentation. There's a summary report provided to the district with all the backup information, but we want to just give you some quick highlights this evening. So with that, first thing I want to do is, does anyone have a clicker for me? Or
It's up there. It's up there on the table.
This guy? Yep. There we go. All right, so just want to tell to you a little bit about the team. So what had happened was when the concerns were raised and the district was looking for some guidance with regard to how to handle rubberized floors that may contain mercury, they were looking for some support and some guidance because as of this stage, New Jersey doesn't have any set regulations in there for them to follow. So they wanted to try to ensure the safety of the children and the staff and the visitors. So they charged myself. I have been working with the district as the engineer for quite some time with basically managing a project and bringing a team together of other individuals. So on that team is Michael Mentz, who's a certified industrial hygienist. As well on the team is James Eberts of Epic Environmental. James, if you happen to have seen him, was the gentleman who went out into the field and physically conducted the sampling for us. And coordinate with the lab, and Tom Pruno of Environmental Design, to try to bring 4 different entities together to really collaborate because absent regulations, trying to get guidance, we want to make sure that we have good collaboration of feedback and professionals. So first order of business is, this is just a simple listing of all the rubberized floors within the district. So each of the elementary schools within the gymnasiums has a rubberized floor. The Bunker Hill Middle School gym, and we'll call it adaptive or auxiliary gym, it has kind of a dual use, as well as the dance studio of the Washington Township High School within the 11-12 wing. Unfortunately, what we discovered, so within the elementary schools, if you're familiar with the district schools, there's what I'll call the 4 sister schools, Bells, Birches, Wedgwood, Whitman. They and Bunker Hill were all built in approximately 1997. So those rubberized floors were installed at that time. At Herfield, Thomas Jefferson, and within the high school, those spaces, I think in the past, had VCT flooring, vinyl composite tile that you might see in a classroom space typical, and rubberized flooring was added sometime in or around 2006. So what had happened was for multiple decades, rubberized floorings have been very popular at the elementary and the middle school level. At the high school level, you're more used to seeing a wooden gym floor. In some elementary school levels, you may see an all-purpose room where you don't have a rubberized floor, but when you truly have a gym, just because of the impact issues, it's very popular to put that in. So what had come to light was that when these floors were manufactured and or installed, some mercury compounds were put into the process or into the products, and as they have degraded over time, they have the potential to release mercury vapors. As it is unfortunate for this school district with regard to some of these floors, even though they were installed in 2006 plus when you were not supposed to be putting mercury in these floors anymore, unfortunately, every single one of these rubberized floors is mercury containing. Okay. So before we get into the results of the air sampling, what I wanted to do, and I know this is difficult to read, but we'll kind of go through the numbers with you, is I want to turn this over to Mike Mentz, and Mike wants to review some regulations and not regulations, right?
All right, good evening, everybody. So, these values listed are basically air samples or air concentrations. There's different occupational exposures, and that's where all of the research started through the decades of employers being responsible to monitor and provide safe work environments for their employees. So through these occupational exposures over the decades, the EPA and OSHA and World Health Organizations have been able to calculate, quote, acceptable levels. So there is a US OSHA standard of 100 micrograms per cubic meter. There's a NIOSH, where they have a recommended level of 50 micrograms per cubic meter. And it goes down to ACGIH TLV, which is basically, it differs from OSHA, where OSHA says this is permissible, but it may not necessarily be safe in the eyes of OSHA. A TLV is basically what this government industrial hygiene group says a working adult can be repeatedly exposed to day after day for a working lifetime with no detrimental effects. So, you know, in that occupational setting, a TLV is much more desirable than a permissible exposure, because a permissible exposure encompasses economic factors, where a TLV is strictly health-based. That's all well and good, but now we're really not into an occupational setting. We're into an educational situation. We have children involved. So there were some events that happened in Minnesota, and they have some values, and it goes all the way down. So I just really want to focus on the bottom one, which you probably can't see. So the New Jersey Department of Health issued a guidance value of 0.8 micrograms per cubic meter of air. So then it comes to, and this is what I spend day in and day out trying to explain to people, what does that mean? 0.8 micrograms per cubic meter. So for those of you who may or may not embrace math or embrace the metric system, you need to know what that really is. So changing the units, we've all heard of a meter. Then we probably heard of a millimeter. So a millimeter is 1/1000th of a meter. Then if we take 1/1000th of that millimeter, we have a micrometer. So a micrometer is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. Now let's change that meter back to a gram. We're in 1/1,000,000th of a gram is the quantity we're talking about. So if you need a visual, I usually try to explain to somebody, because I do a lot of lead dust and lead talks, figure one raisin weighs a gram. And you're going to take that raisin and chop it up into 1,000,000 equal-sized pieces. Then you're going to take one of those pieces and chop 20% off. That's our 0.8 micrograms. So that's the guidance value that the New Jersey Department of Health is recommending people follow as an acceptable concentration. Now, concentration then goes into something different called a dose. So this concentration is a protective value geared to protect preschool children. And in 8:50, after that unfortunate event where a daycare or a preschool was built in a thermometer factory, that's where a lot of these studies came up. And they have what there's an equation where they can come up with an acceptable dose based on an acceptable concentration. So this 0.8 micrograms per cubic meter is based on protecting a 3-year-old child in that space 8 hours a day for 180 days a year. And that dose is based on time, concentration, and body weight. So a 3-year-old obviously has a lot less body weight than this middle-aged man, or upper middle-aged man. So it's a very protective value geared to protect a 3-year-old, which would even be more protective of a 10-year-old, which is even more protective of faculty. And that again is really important based on 8 hours of occupancy a day, 180 days a year, which is equivalent to a school year. The other thing, I tried to stress the minuteness of these quantities. 0.8 is good, but 0.9 doesn't mean run. There's a very fine line, and when we're dealing with measurements of this small magnitude, various fluctuations happen. But that's the target value that the New Jersey DOH wants us to use as a starting point. And if we are below 0.8, we're protective of 3-year-olds, let alone grade schoolers and high schoolers and staff and faculty. So as I mentioned at the previous meeting, and this corresponds with Arizona and the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, they have these values that they're recommending. Again, these are not statutory requirements, but what we recommended is if our concentrations are 1 microgram or less, that functional space is acceptable for continued use. If those air samples start getting results above 1 up to 3, then the recommendation is let's start trying to do some remedial action, continued surveillance of the area, figuring out, limit the occupancy, why did these get elevated? And Anina's going to talk later, temperature is a variable. But that 1 to 3, it's not get out, but let's start trying to, keep monitoring the situation. What the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry recommends, which is our recommendation, is if our air sample concentrations are exceeding 3 micrograms, let's stop using that space until we can get it back down. They are conservative recommendations to protect human health. And that's all I have to say about that, I guess.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, so small on the slide, but I'm going to read it off to you just so we all have a little bit of a comfort level. So what we had done and what I had reported on about a month ago is we had just started doing air sampling. And when we just started doing air sampling, we had, before we had done all the testing of the floors, we knew that there was mercury-containing floors at Bell's, and we knew that there was mercury-containing floors at Bunker Hill School. So those had already been tested, and we had already received those results back a month ago. What we had basically arranged was as soon as we confirmed that all of the bulk samples, all of the floors were mercury-containing, we proceeded with air sampling at each school location where there was a rubberized floor. So what we found, once we got our first set of results at Bell's and our first set of results at Bunker Hill, well, I'll read you off the numbers. At Bell's, we had some results that were non-detect, meaning they did not detect anything for the mercury vapors in the air below a threshold, to up to 0.16 microgram per meter cubed. So 0.16 as compared to the 1 that Mike had mentioned a little bit ago, or the 0.8. So Bell's Elementary School, what we chose to do is we said, listen, those results are good, but let's increase the ventilation anyway. Don't need to retest because I know I had a fair result, but we increased the ventilation anyway because why not make it better, okay? But because we already had a fair result, we didn't need to test. We know that the more you ventilate the space, the more fresh air you introduce, the more you can lower those values. So we took our fresh air at Bell's from 20 to 50%, but because we already had favorable results, and I won't lie to you, it is expensive to do this air sampling. I did not recommend additional be done at this moment in time. What it came down to at Bunker Hill was that we had, we tested both the auxiliary gym and the main gym. Now, when we had talked about it, I think at the last meeting, I think I reported it as a general average between the grouping of them. So if you say, hey, that's not the exact number you gave me last time, let me explain to you that, when we were talking to school, I just gave the auxiliary gym and the gym are immediately adjacent to one another. So, they are similar conditions. So the average at the gym had been 0.49 micrograms per meter cubed, and at the auxiliary gym, 0.63. Given those results, again, they may have been under the 0.8 or under the 1, but we, again, moved forward with immediately increasing ventilation to the space because we'd like to get it lower. Because those results were of a threshold, I'd say at or over 0.5, kind of half of where we were hoping to be, we increased the ventilation. We reran testing at Bunker Hill. So we reran air testing. So I'm going to just stick with Bunker Hill, and then I'll go through the other schools. So when we reran the air testing at Bunker Hill, we waited till we had finished every school in its first round. And we, at the main gym, got results that were from non-detect, again, to 0.16 microgram per meter cube, which was with increased ventilation. At the auxiliary gym, the day we were doing the test, the HVAC unit worked, but it had to be manually reset. So it wasn't working as efficiently as we had wanted it to. It was on increased ventilation. It still had a reduction of the vapor from 0.63 to 0.48 micrograms per meter cube. But because of that, there was a part that had to be purchased to ensure it was back into fully automatic mode. We ran a third round at Bunker Hill once everything was back into fully automatic mode with that ventilation. And the main gym came back similar with the second round at 0.15 microgram per meter cubed, and the auxiliary gym of 0.33 microgram per meter cubed. So at Bunker Hill, the increased ventilation actually resulted in, at the main gym, a 69% reduction in the mercury vapors, and at the auxiliary gym, a 47% reduction. So again, getting them much lower, although already within acceptable levels, even lower, and as can be reasonably achieved with increase in ventilation. At Birch's Elementary School, our first average test was 0.6. We reran that with an increase in ventilation, and that came down to 0.17 microgram per meter cubed, a 71% reduction. Whitman Elementary School actually had the highest initial result of 0.86 microgram per meter cubed. When we had increased the ventilation, that had a 48% reduction down to 0.44. Wedgwood, Herfield, Thomas Jefferson, and the high school all had levels that range from non-detect to just over 0.3 micrograms per meter cubed. What I will tell you is that at those schools, we did not rerun samples with increased ventilation, but at all schools with rubberized schools, the district had increased ventilation. And also, a few of the tests, and I believe the first one at Bunker Hill, although the anticipation was to have a temperature set point of 68 degrees in the space, it was hovering around 70. So facilities work to try to ensure that they're keeping those spaces around 68 degrees room temperature. Sometimes that means the set point is different, but try to achieve a 68-degree temperature. The warmer the space, you increase vapor pressure, and more vapors want to come up out of the floor. So at a 68-degree temperature, you can keep more of it contained and not vaporizing out, and basically creating a better condition. Same thing with the ventilation. The more you ventilate the space, the better the results will be. So by and large, I know no one wants to know that there's mercury-containing floors, and no one wants to know that there's any mercury vapors whatsoever, but we, like many schools throughout the state, throughout the region, have this condition. The results put you in a very good place, are well within the threshold levels that Mike had indicated. But that being said, there are further recommendations that we have provided to the district. So this is kind of an abbreviated version of the report next steps. So obviously the increase in ventilation was able to give us a much improvement to the mercury vapor conditions in the gyms. So our recommendation to the district is to maintain that increased ventilation. So just a little bit of HVAC is that in this particular space, or in a school space, you may say have 20% outside air coming from outside, maybe 80% of it is recirculated air in the space. That was how our initial samples were done, typical HVAC condition. The increased ventilation is actually bringing in 50% outside air and then recirculating only 50%, so you're bringing in more fresh air continuously. So you're continuously bringing in that 50%. So as the day goes on, you get a better air quality condition. So there's one more set of air sampling that has not been done, but it is not something that is going to have an immediate impact. But we do want to run a worst case test, because as I mentioned, as you increase temperature, you have the potential to increase vapors. Every single one of these gyms has air conditioning. Okay, but if the air conditioning was to fail, we want to know what those thresholds would be. So we're going to, on a completely unoccupied weekend condition, run a worst case scenario, increasing the temperature in the space to see if it puts us at a level of what Mike's prior recommendations that would say, don't use the space. And what that would be guidance to the school district to say, hey, in a worst case scenario, should I, if my HVAC system and I can't cool it breaks down, should I not use the space? Or do I need to make sure that for summer rec programs that we have the cooling going for any of those type of activities? So that's still to follow, but it doesn't impact the immediate condition of where we're at. With regard to these mercury floors, they do degrade over time. So as they do degrade, this is something that needs to be, our recommendation is that the district plan to, as it can be budgeted, to remove these floors. And do it in a priority fashion to remove the floors, to remove, even though we're under something we can handle with ventilation, we'd rather remove the source from the get-go. Based on the results that I had read to you earlier, the two schools that had the highest initial levels, and even after the ventilation increased, the highest level was Whitman Elementary School, and because of the age of students. So just from a recommendation of prioritization, I have recommended to the district that Whitman be number 1, Bunker Hill number 2, for consideration of removal of those floors. In the full report, we gave a follow-up prioritization, but that's the higher priority. Until they are replaced, we do recommend that seasonal air sampling be conducted just to make sure that good air quality is maintained. And then lastly, it is important for the district just to maintain best practices on these floors, to make sure that they stay in fair working order, that any of their typical cleaning practices or just watch for tears, any issues, that they just maintain a good maintenance program on the floors. So with that, I think I'm just going to switch to the next one, and I'll switch back to any slide anyone wants. I know this was a lot of information, and but I will tell you that by and large, good information. No one wants to hear that it exists, that there's mercury in these floors, but there is. No one wants to hear that there's any vapor in the air, but there are some, but the levels are dramatically lower than threshold limits, and I think with the increase in ventilation, we can maintain them at good levels, and we have an ability and action plan to move forward.
Thank you, Anina and Mike. We're going to make a slight change in our agenda and move public comment to now so that people can ask questions dedicated to this topic if they have that. So if you're interested in asking a question related to the presentation, please get a yellow card and pass it to Dr. Garrison, and you can come up to the microphone and ask your questions. Are there any questions from the board at this time? While we wait for that.
Julie, I had 2 questions. The issue of air conditioning, I assume that's going to change our practice with regard to running our air conditioners. I know in the summertime especially, those are times where they get shut down. Long weekends, they get shut down. So that was my one question. And a question for the attorney. The gyms or the blue rooms that had the mercury in it, that was when they shouldn't have had the mercury in it, is there a statute of repose or any kind of action we can? That was 2008. We would not have known that they put that substance in the floors till we tested it. Do we have any right of recovery if we have to pull that stuff out?
It's actually something that Joe and I was just talking about now and previously. There's a 10-year statute of limitations. That's the statute of repose. So I got to. There's a 10-year statute of repose for any type of construction contracts.
I thought it was 15.
I can take a look at it, but I got to find out exactly when these things were put in, when was the acceptance, all these things. Maybe there's some exceptions, but something we're definitely going to be looking into.
Thanks.
Joe, you may answer her.
The electric.
Go ahead, you can answer.
You know that stuff.
We've been running the Air 24/7, and I did adjust the budget to reflect that.
Thank you.